Doug, thank you. And ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this webinar, where we're absolutely delighted that Ambassador Nicholas Burns is joining us from Massachusetts, and will be talking to us about topics of great moment, particularly with the upcoming US election and with fairly radical changes in the way in which foreign policy affairs have been conducted in recent years. Just by way of background, Ambassador Nick Burns is the Goodman Family Professor of the Practice of Diplomacy and International Relations at the Harvard Kennedy School. He is faculty chair of the Future of Democracy project and also the project on Europe and the Transatlantic relationship at the Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. He's executive director of the Aspen Strategy Group and Aspen Security Forum and a senior counselor at the Cohen Group. He's also chairman of the board of Our Generation Speaks, which seeks to bring together young Palestinians and Israelis in common purpose. Nick Burns served in the United States government as a career Foreign Service officer. He was Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs from 2005 to 2008, the State Department's third-ranking official. He was the United States Ambassador to NATO from 2001 to 5, Ambassador to Greece, and State Department spokesman. He worked on the National Security Council as Senior Director for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia Affairs. He was Special Assistant to President Clinton and Director for Soviet Affairs for President George H.W. Bush. And he served in the American Consulate General in Jerusalem, where he coordinated US economic assistance to the Palestinian people in the West Bank, and before that at the American embassies in Egypt and Mauritania. So, Nick, thank you so much for joining us today. And I wondered if we could just start off with my asking you the question, I suppose, that's on everybody's minds. Will a change in the US administration materially affect foreign policy and especially US-China relations?
Thank you. Roddy, thank you so much for this invitation to be with you and your colleagues today. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be with you. Roddy, the answer to your question is there is a stark difference, obviously, between President Trump's view of the world and view of the role of the United States in it and that of Vice President Biden. I have to declare from the outset that I am highly subjective on this matter. I've been an advisor to the Joe Biden campaign for the last 18 months. But I'm also someone who has served, as you noted, as a career diplomat, both Republican and Democratic administrations for 3 decades. And I'm convinced that that Joe Biden's view, which is America needs to re-engage with the rest of the world, is the correct one. It's supported by the large majority of Americans in most of our public opinion polls of the last 2 years. It's interesting, these polls show that the American people are not isolationist. The majority of Americans believe in NATO, 75% approval rating for NATO in the Chicago Council on Global Affairs poll. They believe in trade, including free trade by slimmer majorities. They believe that we should be receiving immigrants and refugees and that we should be active in the world. So I think a Biden administration, and I'm not speaking for him today, obviously, but just speaking about what he has been saying on the campaign trail, he said we need to embrace NATO and rededicate ourselves to NATO. He believes the European Union is a partner, a priority partner of the United States, not a competitor, as President Trump has said. Biden has also said that we'll rejoin the Paris Climate Change Agreement, we'll rejoin the World Health Organization. Of course, President Trump is on the opposite side of all those issues. So I do think this is about as clear a choice in foreign policy as the United States has had in half a century between 2 candidates. You probably have to go back to the election of 1964, Lyndon Johnson versus Barry Goldwater, to see such a stark difference in attitude towards a basic issue: what shall our role be? And of course, there is a great many differences on domestic issues. So the choice is clear. Biden has a very comfortable lead now, if you believe the polls. And I was on the Hillary Clinton campaign in 2016, and we did not win. And so 2 weeks from today, we'll find out when the American people go to the polls.
Interesting. And tell me, with regards to the central, one of the central planks of the Trump administration's foreign policy, and it interests us obviously as the Asia Scotland Institute, the way in which this administration has been dealing with China, the trade war, because there's a knock-on effect, of course, for us in Europe and elsewhere, because it impacts us all. How do you think about that? And of course, in the context of your own book on Kissinger, the negotiator, who handled China very differently.
Well, it's interesting, Roddy. I think we've seen a stark change in both of our political parties in the United States about how to handle relations with China. We established our formal ambassadorial diplomatic relations, full diplomatic relations, not in 1972, when President Nixon and Henry Kissinger went to China to beat Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai, but in 1979, when Jimmy Carter and Deng Xiaoping were able to get US-China relations to the highest level. And for most of those 4 decades, I would describe the policy of every administration as one of engagement with China, also with competition. I think it's flipped now. We now have almost an entirely competitive relationship between China and the United States, with episodic periods of cooperation. And I don't think there's a great difference, frankly, between President Trump and Joe Biden on the main issue, which is that China is seeking to reduce American military primacy in the Indo-Pacific. I'm teaching a class on that later this afternoon here at Harvard. And there's no question that there's a battle underway for military positioning throughout the Indian Ocean and the Western Pacific. And we can talk more about that. There's really no difference between the candidates in our 2 political parties, and really no difference between liberals and conservatives. If you think about Trump on the right and a Bernie Sanders on the left, that on trade, China has not conformed to the World Trade Organization standards on intellectual property rights. There has been tremendous job loss in our society and in yours and others. In Japan, for instance, in part because China has not played by the rules. And third, Roddy, I think there's a great deal of concern in our country over what's just happened during the course of the pandemic over the last 6 months, that under cover of the pandemic, as the United States, the United Kingdom, and India have struggled with the pandemic, what has China been doing? It's essentially smothered Hong Kong's democracy this past summer. It has bullied the Philippines and Vietnam in the South China Sea. It instigated a conflict along the long border between India and China, a very aggressive series of actions against the Uyghur population in Xinjiang province. And so there's alarm here that China is acting under Xi Jinping much more assertively than it did under Hu Jintao, Jiang Zemin, or Deng Xiaoping before him. And that there has to be a reaction by the West. The reaction, I think, that many of us believe is most appropriate is the development of the Quad. You will have seen that 2 weeks ago, the foreign ministers of Japan, India, Australia, and the United States met in Tokyo. The Quad has been, for 15 years, an on and off proposition. There have been times when both the Indian government and the Australian government have opted out, but all 4 are now opting in because of the problems India has had on its border, because of the bullying of Australia in many ways by the Chinese government over the last 6 to 7 months, and the pushing back by the Australian government, and the real concern that Prime Minister Suga, the new Prime Minister of Japan, has. And I would say that that is now congealing the Quad. The question for the Quad is, can it become a more permanent military arrangement to limit China's military ambitions? And can it even develop maybe an economic and political arm, and also include some other countries in the process as it goes along? But clearly, I think if you ask most Americans who have served in government or may be serving in a future government, they would say this is the most important challenge that we face globally, and that is long-term. And that is the threat from China, not wishing to fight China, but we are wishing to limit China.
And Nick, the Obama administration, when it announced its tilt towards the Pacific, I mean, it looked as if the United States of America was going to get more engaged, but the decision by this administration to withdraw from the TPP, that obviously, I suppose inevitably, has created a vacuum which I suppose observers would say China has been quite speedy to fill with its behavior in the South China Seas, with its fairly overt aggressive comments towards Taipei. And it is as if China, and people talk obviously about the Thucydides trap, is indeed as the rising power, certainly in that part of the world, producing a real both economic and military threat to the United States, which the next administration will have some difficulty, presumably, addressing.
Well, I think this, either for a Trump second term or for a Biden first term, beyond the immediate priorities, the battling the pandemic, trying to resuscitate our economy and the global economy, those two big challenges. And I do think that a Biden or Trump administration would look inward in the next year to focus on those problems. Beyond them, there is going to be intense focus on China. I think the criticism that I would level against President Trump is that he's had some important insights about how to, about the need to object to aspects of China's behavior, but he has not had a consistent strategy. He's also pursued this, Roddy, as you imply, mostly unilaterally. It would have been far more effective if President Trump had continued with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, because that was a big strategic power move against Chinese power in the Indo-Pacific. And President Trump gave that up at the very beginning of his administration. Trade it's going to be difficult, I think, to reconstitute that in the short term, because trade, of all of the major issues we face, is going to be contested inside both of our large political parties, but also between them. And it maybe is not going to be the first step that a Trump administration or a Biden administration would take, in my judgment. But I think there's a realization here among many people in the United States that we cannot go it alone, that if we're interested in countering unfair Chinese trade practices, we'd be far better off working in tandem with Japan and the European Union, as well as the US and the UK. That's well more than 60% of global GDP. That's real leverage in dealing with the Chinese. And the president has, in his infatuation with acting alone in the world, not really paying attention to our partners and allies. I think he's weakened his policy towards China. It's been largely ineffective on the trade side.
Yeah. Turning more perhaps to the military side, you were, of course, the US ambassador to NATO for a number of years. And as a former NATO warrior, it's been rather disturbing seeing the extent to which the current administration of the United States of America has succeeded in irritating the other members of NATO, even though, of course, his call for 2%, moving towards a 2% contribution may be valid. But he is not the most popular person in NATO circles at the moment. And that is of concern, of course, to the UK and elsewhere, and to the allies of the United States of America, who, under Article 5, stepped up at the time of 9/11, as we all recall. How would you view the state of NATO at the moment?
I think NATO is largely leaderless right now. I think there's a sense of collective shock in the alliance that President Trump has never reaffirmed Article 5. He's had several attempts to do so. People have asked him directly, and he's never affirmed it. And that is the critical, part of our deterrence against Russia. Roddy, I was the American ambassador to NATO on 9/11, and I certainly do remember and recall the way that NATO stepped up. The UK ambassador, Emir Jones-Perry, a very close friend of mine, called me early on in the crisis that day and agreed that the US should push, along with the UK and others, for the invocation of Article 5. It was a key moment. We need that kind of collective defense in the world today in Europe. And for all the talk of a new, even a renewed pivot to the Indo-Pacific, I do think there's going to be a heavy concentration on Europe by the next administration, because Russia is still a major problem for us, and Europe is so important. The EU is actually the largest trade partner of the United States, even with the departure of the United Kingdom. And the EU is the largest investor into the American economy. And of course, NATO is the largest collection of our allies that we have anywhere in the world. So Asia, the Indo-Pacific is going to be a focus, but I think there'll be a renewed focus for the reasons that you suggest, Roddy, because President Trump is the first American president since before the Second World War not to assert that we have to have a priority strategic relationship, not just with the United Kingdom, but with all of our allies in Western Europe, and in Eastern Europe. So I do think we're going to see renewed pushes in both the Indo-Pacific and in Europe, the transatlantic relationship. I think, we should talk about this. It makes the development of a renewed US-UK strategic partnership very important. One of the things that I do is I'm chairman of American Ditchley, and we work in support of Mother Ditchley in Oxfordshire. And we had a conference in early September between the two of us, between Ditchley and American Ditchley, on the US-UK relationship. And there are many opportunities for us to deepen our military ties between the US and UK. And I think our political ties. A trade agreement is going to be tricky because if the UK government proceeds with a no-deal exit or Brexit with this autumn, and if a hard border rematerializes on the island of Ireland between the Republic and Northern Ireland, Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi are on record publicly saying that they will not support a US-UK trade agreement if it injures the Good Friday Agreement. There's tremendous support in the United States for Ireland, for the Republic of Ireland. And I just hope that's not lost on the government at number 10 Downing Street.
Well, the trading relationship with the United States obviously is critical, and it was a key component of the Brexiteers' argument that in freeing themselves, as it were, from continental Europe, they would be able to build on the bridge with the United States of America, chlorinated chicken or not, as they were saying. But that doesn't seem to be falling into place particularly well as either. I mean, there is the issue you quite correctly mentioned about Ireland, but there doesn't seem to have been much progress made with regards to trading links with the United States at the moment. Or people talk about the Canadian model or the Australian model. Are you optimistic that that will happen?
I'm not in the short term. When Dominic Raab came, the foreign secretary, came to Washington a couple of weeks ago, when it looked like the Johnson government might be considering a no-deal exit, he was given a fairly stiff welcome by the Speaker of the House. And I think there's no question the Democrats will retain control of the House, so Nancy Pelosi will be Speaker. Yeah. And then Joe Biden in succession, 2 public statements. And in the United States, a trade deal has to be ratified by the Congress. And so the president can negotiate one, but the Congress is the executive, is the authority, the legislative authority. And the Democrats are sending a very strong signal that that a reimposition of that hard border is going to disqualify and stop a US-UK trade agreement. So I do worry about the US-UK relationship. I think if Vice President Biden wins, I certainly hope in 2021 progress can be made in putting our relationship on the proper foot that it needs to be, because Britain is still a critical US strategic ally.
Absolutely. Taking you back now, turning back towards Asia by way of the Middle East. I think that Asia is actually technically defined as being from Syria in the west to Japan in the east. The current administration's policy towards the Middle East has been interesting, at the very least. I suppose they would trumpet one of their great achievements as being the moving of the embassy to Jerusalem. But there's a fair degree of chaos in that part of the world, it seems to me, from which Russia and to a certain extent Turkey have benefited. Do you see any changes taking place there? And have you got any observations to make about how this has developed?
Well, I think, Roddy, you're right to ask about this. From 9/11, that's 19 years ago, the United States, I think, has probably focused more strategically on the greater Middle East than any other part of the world. And I think there's a recognition in our country, we need to be focused primarily on the Indo-Pacific and on the transatlantic relationship. Those are the 2 key strategic regions of the world for our economic and military and political interests. And so a repositioning of the United States towards the Indo-Pacific and Western Europe, I think it's underway already. What does that mean for the Middle East? We need coherence in our strategy. And again, I'm a critic of President Trump. I don't see a coherent strategy over the last 4 years. President Trump seems to make decisions based, as you know, based on the latest conversation he's had with Erdogan or Putin. And he's given way to both of them and has not stood up to either of them, particularly in the case of Erdogan, when President Trump, I think quite foolishly, agreed to withdraw American special forces, the majority of our special forces, east of the Euphrates River in Syria. That led to the resignation of our Secretary of Defense, General Jim Mattis, over that issue, the principle that we stand up for our friends, the Syrian Kurds. And, you know, if you think about withdrawing from the Iran nuclear deal, and then not offering anything to replace it, and then sanctioning and threatening sanctions against the United Kingdom and France and Germany because you didn't withdraw from the agreement that we negotiated with you. It's been fairly chaotic. And I think what we need is, over the long term, to develop a consistent strategy, not based on the presence of large-scale American military forces in either Iraq or in Afghanistan, but based on American support for those countries that are important to us. It's certainly Egypt and Jordan, Israel, the Gulf states, all important for American security interests. We do have, I think, a strategic imperative in trying to limit Iran's capacity for mayhem and chaos in Yemen, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and Gaza. Iran has been quite divisive, as you know, and quite violent in what it's done through the Revolutionary Guards. And so I think that's the makings of an American policy, and trying to work to limit the more negative aspects of both Turkish diplomacy in the region. I'm thinking of Libya, but also Russian diplomacy. And of course, there's going to be a major humanitarian effort that's needed to try to help the Syrian people recover from this disastrous war of the last 11 years.
Yeah. Final question from me, because then I think we will start to open this up to others. You teach, you obviously talk about the lessons learned from the Kissinger time. I get the feeling that many people in the Foreign Service in the United States of America are pretty demoralized. I don't know that they have responded particularly well to the leadership from the Secretary of State or his predecessor, as a matter of fact. And there have been stories of people at ambassadorial level leaving the Foreign Service and others. Do you see, do you get the sense that some lessons to be learned from the way in which foreign policy and diplomacy has been conducted in the past, the United States can re-establish itself as a meaningful force in diplomatic circles?
Well, thank you, Roddy. It's a big subject, and it's one that's deeply of concern to me as a retired member of the American Foreign Service. I started in the Foreign Service 40 years ago as a lowly intern in our embassy in Nouakchott, Mauritania, in the summer of 1980. And so I've seen the Foreign Service develop, wax and wane over those 4 decades. I've never seen the State Department with such low morale, so much sidelined by the Trump administration. There was a point a couple of months ago when President Trump said publicly, the State Department, he said, is part of the deep state. I don't believe we have a deep state in the United States. That's a populist, that's a populist fantasy, but that's what the president has said. And we do need to see a wholesale rebuilding of American diplomacy, of the State Department, budgetary support. There has to be, I think, a rededication to diplomacy. And Roddy, I'd say that looking back over the last 2 decades and dating it to 9/11, there's been an over-militarization of American foreign policy. We came out swinging after 9/11 with you in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in the so-called war against terrorism, a great premium placed on the military on point with diplomacy and reserve, and a very wise man, Secretary of State Colin Powell, for whom I worked when I was ambassador to NATO, he used to say the reverse. As a military person, he said, the way to position our strategic assets is diplomats on point, military and reserve. And I do think there's been an awakening of sorts in our country that we need to strengthen our ability to act diplomatically and reinforce the diplomats. And we've overutilized, depended too much on the military. I'll just leave you with this thought. I teach students from obviously the United States and all over the world at Harvard, and we have a program that brings military officers, usually at the major colonel level, from all of our 5 services to Harvard for a year. We have 35 of them, I think, this year. And I sit down with them. And when I ask them, where have you been since 9/11, the more senior of these people have had 5 and 6 combat tours. They've been away from the United States, away from their families. It's actually the most intensively deployed generation of military officers in the history of our country, going back to the 18th century. And there's a real palpable sense that we need to turn back to diplomacy to try to resolve some of these very complex problems beyond just reflexively asking the military to deploy in a violent way. And I think that belief in the military that they have been overutilized is quite strong in this generation.
Very interesting, Nick. Well, thank you. I'm going to hand over now to Doug Cook to handle questions. He'll have something himself as well, but this has been very interesting. Doug, over to you.
Thank you, Roddy.
Roddy, thank you. Ambassador, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Pleasure, thank
I've
you
got
so much.
one question. I have one question from a member of the audience. He's not able to ask the question himself, but perhaps if I could put his question first. He's asking about your perception of any concerns you might have about sort of levels of civil unrest, both before and after the US election, if President Trump contests any vote against him. And what would your view be about the potential for violence from white supremacists and such like?
Well, I am concerned as a citizen, and it's a very good and deep and troubling question. Obviously, the great majority of the American people are law-abiding, and the great majority of Americans would never dream of taking to the streets to contest an election where their side lost. But we do have a problem of white supremacy in the United States. That's according to the FBI, which deems it the most important problem relating to social unrest that we have in the country today. You've seen these images of people with guns in some of our states, not in Massachusetts where I live, but in some states, people can carry guns into public places, into restaurants, into churches, into schools. And you saw gunmen try to intimidate legislators both in Michigan and in Wisconsin. Now they've unveiled this nefarious plot to kidnap and perhaps even kill the governor of Wisconsin because she had the temerity to impose mask wearing and social distancing in the middle of a national and global pandemic. The same kind of plot was uncovered against the governor of Virginia. What makes this all worse is that President Trump is encouraging these people, these paranoid, right-wing, I think anti-American populist groups, gun-toting groups, and the president is enabling them, encouraging them, favoring them. There's a fascinating article in this morning's New York Times. There's another organization, a QAnon organization, that believes that there's a great conspiracy in Washington, D.C. by our elected politicians against the American people. And it accuses most of the American government of pedophilia. Can you imagine this? And yet, this is an active force in places like Georgia, and there's a candidate running who may well win a seat in Congress who holds these views. So we're in a time of paranoia.
Oh, thank you very much, Ambassador,
right-wing
for
populism.
the excellent talk. And
I do worry that if President Trump loses the election, and that's probably what's going to happen, he may contest it. He may call his supporters to take to the streets. But having said all that, if that's the scenario, if that scenario plays out, I think it's still a minority probability if it does. I think most Republicans will stand up against it, and most Republicans will counsel the president to accept his defeat. What is critical to any democracy in the UK
and I was
or the US
what would be
the peaceful transfer of power, that those who are defeated
US
accept their defeat.
Cannot take.
Council General, thank you very much. And I should have said at the beginning, have in the White House, and I'm not someone. I really wish I could have been as accustomed with excoriating American presidents in public. Cities in the world. We have an authoritarian, certainly one of the great cities of the United Kingdom. And I envy you your diplomatic assignment, Council General. He doesn't truly believe in our post-pandemic, we can dream of travel, and we need to get him out. You know, I think, Council General, you've really identified one of the greatest problems that we have in American foreign policy today. In addition to ignoring our alliances,
Consul General, if you'd like to ask your question, please.
Which President Trump has done. And in addition to disrupting the world trade system, I think the lack of attention to democracy and human rights the lack of attention has been a hallmark by the presidency. The president, if you did a Lexis search of every word he has uttered as president of the United States, I don't believe he's ever stood up to support democracy at a time when the authoritarian powers, China and Russia, are very much challenging democracy in both the Indo-Pacific as well as in Europe. And you identified the places where the president has not spoken out. He did not say a single word in defense of the people of Hong Kong in June, July, August, September. As these very, I think the Consul General has identified a major problem, and that is at a time when China and Russia have been so assertive in pushing the authoritarian model. There's been silence from the White House. President Trump did not say a single word in support of the people of Hong Kong this past summer and this autumn. If you believe John Bolton, who just published a dramatic book about his time as National Security Advisor, President Trump told President Xi Jinping at the Buenos Aires G20 summit in August 2019 that the United States would not oppose President Xi Jinping placing Uyghurs into so-called concentration camps in Xinjiang province, which is disgraceful for the president not to speak up on behalf of the Uyghur population. The president has been silent on the situation of Belarus, has not said a single word in support of people marching for freedom in Belarus. And so I think that's a dramatic diminishing of one of the powers that the United Kingdom and the United States have, and that is that we're two of the world's leading democracies. Our leaders ought to be speaking out on behalf of democracy. The president, I think one of the worst things he's done is to be so uncritical of Xi Jinping, Kim Jong-un, Putin, Erdogan, Viktor Orban, but he's become the leading critic of Angela Merkel. And the invective that he has employed against her is embarrassing. And it's uncivilized behavior on the part of the American president. So just another aspect of this strange, surreal political environment in the United States. I think it's weakened us in foreign policy. So thank you, Consul General.
Thank you very much. Because I thought, the situation in Hong Kong is particularly worrisome, and it could be, the future Crimea in Europe. So, and we have a lot of, the economic interest in Hong Kong. So it's very, very important.
It is, and I guess I should add one thing. I know that Roddy wanted to focus a lot of this on the Indo-Pacific. There has been an increase in support for Taiwan in the United States as we all watched China bully nearly all of its neighbors in the South, in the Spratlys and Paracels, and try to bully India. There's a great sense that we need to step up our political and military support for Taiwan. And I think that that spirit is in both of our political parties. But I do think if there's a Biden administration, Joe Biden will not be silent on human rights violations, and he will be a typical American leader in asserting that a defense of democracy and a defense of human rights. Donald Trump has not done either of those things.
Yeah, I have no comments on US politics, but thank you very much for clarification.
Thank you, Consul General.
Ambassador, thank you very much indeed. We have a question from Jim Carroll. Jim, if you'd like to ask your question, please.
Thank you. I'm a former Irish diplomat, and my question it really touches on a book by Peter Gagan, which I've been reading. It's entitled Democracy for Sale, a Dark Money and Dirty Politics. And essentially it focuses on the US presidential election of 2016, which it discredits, and indeed the Europe referendum in the UK in June of 2016. And I'm just thinking of the US election coming. Ambassador Burns, do you think enough has been done or more needs to be done to save the democratic voice?
Well, Jim, thanks so much for that question. I'm not familiar with the book, but I'm familiar with the problem of money in politics. You know, because of a Supreme Court case about a decade ago called Citizens United, individual Americans can give millions of dollars to these presidential candidates. Both candidates will probably end up spending half a billion US dollars on this election. And as a citizen, it's just my own personal view that money has become far too much a part of the political process. I would favor a more European style or UK style set of elections in which individuals are restricted to very small sums of money that they can use to support a candidate. And that, in fact, I think that our political campaign should be publicly financed. I'm probably in the minority, not the majority in the United States, but I do think that the role of money has been excessive and is cheapening and damaging the political process at home. Having said all that, because of technology, and this is a double-edged sword, because of the incredible presence of both Facebook and Twitter and TikTok and Instagram in our culture as well as yours, individuals do have a channel, a vehicle to speak out that they didn't have before. And so it may be cacophonous, but let a few million or even a few 100 million people speak, and they do in a political campaign like this. So I think on balance, technology has given individuals a greater voice and a greater chance to speak out. If you try to think of those two as drivers, social media and money, of our modern political campaigns.
Could I just mention, though, the funding, big purchases of ads, which apparently are based on falsehoods and mistruths with target, psychographics, Cambridge Analytica. It has distorted the one vote, one citizen, hasn't it?
I think it's diminished it. I agree with you, Jim. I think it's made our politics more coarse. It's deepened the chasm between the two political parties. The loudest voices are on the extremes of our political spectrum, not where most people live and are, which is the middle. It's been interesting to see the evolution of some of the social media companies, particularly Facebook. Facebook has 2.5 billion subscribers, but Facebook has been taking down, and Twitter, statements by some of the more extreme statements of President Trump and some of his advisors have been taken down by Facebook. So they're beginning to hit back a little bit, but clearly, I think we need campaign finance reform. But again, getting that done in this political environment, I think, is going to be a very, very difficult task in the years ahead.
Ambassador, thank you. We have a question from John Delves. John, if you'd like to ask your question, please.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Burns, for a fascinating presentation. Perhaps the biggest challenge in our world is our human continuation of our tribalistic mindset of us versus others. Nowhere is this clearer than in the continuing crisis between Israelis and Palestinians. Can you tell us about the work that you're involved in Our Generation Speaks?
I'd be happy to. I served in the Middle East when I was a young diplomat, and I lived in East Jerusalem in a Palestinian neighborhood with my wife and kids, and got to know the Palestinian issue pretty well from that perspective. And later in my career, I actually negotiated our long-term military assistance agreement with Israel. So I've been on both sides of this issue from an American perspective. Our Generation Speaks is a very small nonprofit based here in Boston, Massachusetts, which attempts to bring young millennial Israeli and Palestinians together in joint business ventures. And it's been fascinating to be part of this. We give them 3 months of business training together, and they live together here in Boston at Brandeis University. And then they go back home. And I've been out to visit them. They set up companies together. These are 25, 30-year-olds. They self-select. They're Palestinians who see a future with Israel. They're Israelis who see a future with the Palestinians. So they're people who want to create a different environment. Thus, Our Generation Speaks. They're speaking about a future of peace. It's interesting when you track over 4 or 5 years, these business ventures, the failure rate's about 65, 70%, which is about the failure rate of most startups in the West. And so it's not atypical. And failure teaches a lot of lessons, but success does too. And we do have a remarkable young woman in Gaza, an Arab Palestinian woman who's created an extraordinary company, a solar energy company, and she's doing good business, and she's able to do that across some of these very difficult political lines. But the other thing I'd tell you is it's extraordinarily difficult for the Palestinians to succeed business-wise. I was out on the West Bank before the pandemic, just meeting these young entrepreneurs, and the harshness of the military occupation, the roadblocks that make it impossible to drive from Jenin and Tulkarem in the northern part of the West Bank to Jerusalem to have a business meeting. You're probably not going to get there. The summary arrests of young Palestinians just taken off the streets with no due process by the Israeli military authorities. It's just difficult to do business from an economic and political and human point of view. So, our view is that there need to be 10,000 of these organizations to try to build peace from the ground up. And it's our attempt. I'm just chairman of the advisory board. All the work's being done by these young people, but it's encouraging. Last thing I'd say is that I think that the Israelis and Palestinians are about as far from peace politically as they've been in a very long time, mainly because the Palestinians are so disunited between the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah and Hamas in Gaza. They won't talk to each other and they won't work together. And it's very difficult to see why the Israelis would make peace from a transactional point of view with one faction and not a united Palestinian entity. And on the Israeli side, I think Prime Minister Netanyahu has shown his true stripes. He's not interested in peace with the Palestinians. And it was interesting, I thought disconcerting yesterday, when the UAE and the Israelis confirmed officially their mutual recognition. That same day, the Israeli government announced another 5,000 settler housing units on occupied land in the West Bank. And so I just think this current Israeli government is incapable of making peace and unwilling with the Palestinians. So the saga goes on, the saga that began with the withdrawal of Britain on May 14th, 1948, as the League of Nations Class C mandate supervisor of Palestine. That's 72 years in the making. I don't see peace in the short term, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you.
Ambassador, thank you very much indeed. We have a question from Anne Packard. Anne, if you'd like to ask your question, please. Anne, you're on mute. Oh, that's it.
No, not. First of all, thank you very much for your presentation. I had a keen interest in it. My uncle was a diplomat who wrote about Southeast Asia, long since dead, sadly, but he was a man in a million. My question is this: how best can Biden recreate the social cohesion which will bring the United States together, given the level of division at the moment? And obviously, I hope that he will win.
So you and I are together in this, Anne. We both hope that he's going to win. Thank you for your question, because I actually think that is the key question. Before we can talk about, what would Joe Biden do about China or the Quad or the Middle East, I think the first job is to try to unite the country or reassemble a sense of one nation. We're so riven by these political factions, red, blue, urban, rural, coastal, interior, right, left, liberal, conservative. Think of all the ways we're divided in the United States. And President Trump has widened the divides. He's played on the divides. He's played on the racial fears of the country, which is combustible. If you think about the influence of race in our society, it's always been, my friend Condoleezza Rice, for whom I worked twice in my career, said often, the original sin of the American Revolution and the Constitution was slavery. And that is something that can really hamper and coarsen American politics if it's not handled carefully. And President Trump has been an arsonist on the race issue. And that continues, by the way, just over the last couple of days, out and out racist statements. So I do think if Joe Biden is elected, I think he'll try very hard. And he's already said this in recent days. He said, he says he'll work with Republicans. He'll consider himself to be president of all 330 million Americans, not just those who voted for him. That's the opposite of how President Trump has acted. So I think you're right. The first thing that he'll have to do is turn to try to unite people through his actions, through his words, through symbols. And certainly, just as in the UK, since both of our countries have been ravaged by the coronavirus, he's going to have to look inward and try to get control over a raging pandemic. I think I said earlier, we have infection rates rising in the majority of our states. We are in a second wave, and it might turn out to be as deadly as the first wave. We have now lost 220,000 Americans dead. And Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, which is one of our great national authorities, believes that that number could rise to 400,000 people dead in the United States. Imagine that. That would be equal the number of soldiers that we lost in the First and Second World Wars, just to give you a sense of historical proportion. So Biden's personality and his beliefs are, he's a uniter. He believes that bringing people together has been part of his political hallmark. I think that'll be a very strong instinct of his if he is elected.
Ambassador, thank you. We have a question from Kelly Stacey. If you'd like to ask your question, please.
Well, let me join you in thanking the ambassador for this interesting conversation. My question would be in the field of arms control and disarmament. And I was thinking in terms of the first 100 days agenda, what would your advice be in terms of the key priorities, bearing in mind that there's an NPT review conference, the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference scheduled for March, that the Russia-US New START agreement needs to be renewed? And would that include, bearing in mind that the Trump administration has undermined multilateralism, would that include supporting the disarmament process of the Korean Peninsula and a renewed interest in the Panmunjom Declaration of 2018?
Well, thank you very much. That's a very, very important and pressing issue. I was reflecting with my class earlier this semester that the arms control situation is as worrisome now as at any time, probably since the early to mid 1960s. If you think about the Test Ban Treaty of 1963, and then that whole generation over 30 years of arms limitation, and we drew down the probability of the use of nuclear weapons between NATO and the Soviet Union and also in East Asia. Now we have a relatively unconstrained environment. The INF Treaty is gone. New START will elapse on February 1st of 2021, just a couple of months from now, if it's not extended. And the Russian government and the Trump administration just failed to agree over this past weekend on an extension of New START. China is absolutely unconstrained. There are no limits on the growth of China's strategic and tactical nuclear weapons. India and Pakistan are relatively unconstrained and fought a very short but very furious 2-day conventional battle just 18 months ago. There's a lot to worry about. I frankly think that the Russians have been the most irresponsible here, not President Trump, in creating this hypersonic breakthrough in nuclear missile technology, in doing what they did to violate the INF agreement that really forced the United States and NATO, the United Kingdom, to withdraw from that or let that agreement lapse. The negotiating tactics of the Russians are known to us, but they were not good negotiating partners for the Trump administration. A lot to worry about. So I do think this will be a focus. If Joe Biden will win, I don't know what he'll do. I don't want to predict what he'll do on what timeline, but certainly New START, there's going to have to be a decision. Do we continue and extend it for a year and then negotiate with the Russians? How would we convince the Chinese to engage in nuclear arms reduction talks with the US, the UK, France, the NATO nuclear powers? Should those talks include Russia, China, and the West, or should they be bilateral talks? That's a tactical negotiating question. On the Korean Peninsula, especially given the revelation of this new ICBM that was paraded down the streets of Pyongyang just 2 weeks ago, but not knowing exactly what this weapon is and whether it works, I think there's going to be a great reluctance by the United States to consider any type of drawdown of American military forces, we ought to be recommitting to the security of South Korea and Japan. They're both treaty allies of the United States. And I think President Trump was right to try to negotiate with Kim Jong-un, but those negotiations failed. And they revealed that Kim Jong-un has zero interest in meaningful reductions in North Korea's nuclear program. So I think that it's back to the drawing board. And I would assume that a successful negotiation would have to include South Korea and Japan, the United States, China, and probably Russia. We did this with the six-party talks in the Bush administration, with the agreed framework in the Clinton administration. We've been doing this for a long time, and we've never been able to successfully stop the North Korean nuclear program from modernizing. So, boy, we've now discussed 7 or 8 issues that make you, they give you a sense of how complex and difficult and even dangerous 2021 and 2022 could be for the world. But thank you for asking about that.
Ambassador, thank you. Perhaps before I hand over to Roddy to conclude, just a question from me, if I may. Clearly, during the coronavirus pandemic, we've seen national governments sort of acting independently for obvious reasons, and not less obviously in Europe, but also in America too. But I fear sometimes that that's sort of been at the expense of some of the multilateral sort of organizations and institutions. And I just wonder whether you share a concern that we're perhaps turning away from these sorts of institutions, or indeed allowing perhaps China to take greater hold in some of these organizations.
Oh, I agree. I agree very strongly with you. You remember back in the Great Recession of 2008 and 9, the G20 congealed. The G20 worked very closely together with the IMF and the World Bank and the other financial institutions to try to address the economic crisis. We did not see this. I thought we might back in February, March, April of this year. The G20 met once and did not act meaningfully together. China chose competition with the United States. The United States chose competition with China. The G7 under American chairmanship met once for 2 or 3 hours. It did not have a meaningful approach. And I think to our shame and embarrassment, the United States walked out of the World Health Organization, and we're the largest funder. And we took our money with us in the middle of the pandemic. And that really put in jeopardy all those countries who do not have strong public health systems, poorer countries. It put them on the back foot. That's why Joe Biden has been saying, we will go back into the World Health Organization and we'll reassert American involvement alongside you and others. And if we need to ask tough questions about why China did not tell the truth back in January and into early February of this year, those questions should be asked. The Australian government was right to put that on the agenda of the WHO, but it doesn't mean you just simply, because you're upset with China or you disagree with China, do you then give China ownership or control of the WHO? Does it then make sense for us to walk out? It made no sense. And I think it really has hurt the image and credibility of the United States in this great global crisis. We've said to the rest of the world, you're on your own. We're not going to help. You saw China last week join COVAX, which is the United Nations, WHO, EU-sponsored initiative to help poorer countries with a vaccine. The Trump administration said, we're not interested. We're going to take care of our own population, but we're not going to be involved internationally. I think it's a great mistake by the Trump administration. That's not how a normal American president would have reacted. But we don't live in normal times, and we don't have a normal president. That's why what happens 2 weeks from today is so important.
Ambassador, thank you. Roddy.
Ambassador Nick, thank you so much. This has been a very interesting conversation. We've covered a lot of subjects, as you yourself have said, which is an indication of the extent to which people on this side of the Atlantic follow with huge interest and great concern the developments in North America. Next Tuesday, it's Tuesday in a week's time, we will be in conversation with Kevin Rudd, the former, as you know, Prime Minister of Australia, and he will be talking with Lord George Robertson, former Secretary General of NATO, who you also know, about some of the challenges that are being faced in that part of the world. But it's been very refreshing to hear from a voice from Massachusetts that gives us cause for hope. Hearing opinions expressed, with which I'm sure almost everybody on this call will identify. And we all from here wish you well in your election, and thank you enormously for taking the time to talk with us this morning, your time. So thank you very much indeed, Nick.